Where there's smoke, there's fire. But when that fire tears through a landscape, what happens next? Today, we dive into the world of pyrophytic ecosystems, those that not only survive, but thrive on fire. A few years ago, the devastating wildfire in California's Mendocino complex became the largest in state history, reshaping the landscape and sparking a national conversation about the role of fire in our environment. For over a century, fire suppression was the cornerstone of U.S. forest management, an effort to protect our woodlands from the flames. But was that the right approach? As the ashes settled, something remarkable happened. Life began to return. Though they're most often seen as a force of destruction, could it be that fire, naturally occurring of course, not those caused by the irresponsibility of humans, could be a catalyst for renewal? I'm Devin Boker. On today's episode of The Wildlife, pyrophytic ecosystems, native plants, and the resilience of nature. Today we have a special guest.
So my name is Ross Barreto. I go by Ross. Pronouns are he, him.
He's a master's student at the University of Florida.
I'm also a urban forester with the University of Florida, where we're currently doing a project looking at the forest health around the city.
Now, originally, Ross was on a completely different path, studying architecture at Seminole State.
Before my art final, I realized I really didn't like doing art, and I was really stressed out, so I identified a tree before my exam, and I was like, well, that was a lot of fun.
There's got to be a job doing something like that, right?
So I started Googling, I discover dendrology, and then I discover forestry, and then I eventually get to botany. And I'm like, all right, I'll be a botanist. That sounds like a good deal.
And then, on what he refers to as an
educated whim,
he decides to leave his hometown behind and transfer to UF.
Because they have like a true botany degree, so I was like, I might as well go all in and do the true botany experience.
Yeah, if you're gonna do it, yeah.
Yeah, and then I get to UF, and UF's pretty good. I'm there like right at the kind of like tail end of COVID, so classes are still like 12 students, and I'm in a class of 4 students. And we're just measuring pine trees on campus at this property called the Natal, or the Natural Area Teaching Lab. And the student who's in charge of that was a PhD student named Gage. He kind of gives the whole spiel about like why they burn the natal and plants depending on fire and that kind of deal. And my whole mind was blown. Like I knew about like fire in Florida, but I was always taught it was like for wildfire prevention. And now I'm being told like, no, the plants in Florida like rely on fire.
Which for some of you listening might sound, I don't know, unhinged, like plants and fire. But I promise, we'll explain.
So I was like, I need to learn more about that. So I started volunteering with him. And then I went to the UF Native Nursery and helped basically jumpstart that with Gage. And got even more involved with native plants. And now I'm here.
Well, and you're so right. I mean, even I remember my first kind of like toe into learning about prescribed burning and stuff. I was like, wait, I'm sorry. We want to start a fire? Like, since when? I mean, Smokey the Bear, like prevent forest fires. You don't want fire. That's since when has that been a good thing? It was kind of like a biological culture shock to be introduced to that idea. Can you tell us, what exactly is like a fire dependent ecosystem? Why is fire important for a lot of our native plants?
So a fire dependent ecosystem is pretty much what it sounds like. It's some sort of community of plants, animals, fungi, even abiotic factors like soil, pH can depend a lot on fire. And all those factors that are reliant on the fire being present is what shapes that ecosystem. So it's almost like this positive feedback loop where the fire is dependent on the plants and the plants are dependent on the fire. So as long as those two things are there, it constantly feeds into itself. So you get this system that's relying on fire. The reason our native plants are so reliant on it, this is true for a lot of the southeast, and a little bit towards like once you get to the Great Plains. But I'm more familiar with the Southeast. Uh, our plants are just adapted from fire. Like natural fire's been in this part of the system for a long time, either through lightning or through human inputs, and then just like the amount of open space that creates because the fire kills canopy trees and shrubs allows for more diversity in the understory, and the diversity in the understory is what brings all the other sort of microfauna like your pollinators, and that's going to bring then your insects and then up and through the food web, and that's what makes a fire ecosystem so important, is that diversity at that base level.
So it's kind of like the idea of like succession. You right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So like you when an area is cleared out, it's kind of it allows for like new stages to be set, or I don't even know
Yeah.
how to put that. Yeah. If you're not familiar with the idea of succession, it's essentially the idea that the species composition and habitat of a community will change over time. When the concept of ecological succession was first developed in the late 1800s, it was thought of as predictable, a directional process mainly controlled or influenced by the physical environment, soil, climate, altitude, marching onward to an eventual climax community, a more perfect collection of species that are the end-all be-all of that environment. Now we know that species composition of a community changes in unpredictable ways. Random events determine the order in which species arrive in the habitat and thus affect the course of succession. Anyway, ecological succession begins with the arrival of pioneer species, opportunistic organisms whose traits allow them to colonize new or newly vacated habitats. They grow and mature quickly and produce lots of offspring capable of dispersing. Later, other hardier and slower growing species will replace the pioneers, and then the replacements are replaced, and so on and so on.
So it's like it's succession, but
Mm-hmm.
on a way more rapid cycle. Because like
Sure.
when you look at like long term succession in like a big old growth forest, like in the floodplains of South Carolina, or a big old growth in the Northeast,
Mm-hmm.
you have a tree that lives 150, 200 years. Sometimes a cypress lives 1,000 plus years, and then the succession happens finally when that tree falls, and you have that huge disturbance.
Mm-hmm.
While with fire, you can have a disturbance every year. You can have it just twice a year, every 3 years, every 5 years.
Yeah.
Some ecosystems are 15 to 50-year fire regime, so it's that more frequent disturbance that allows for that diversity to happen.
That makes a lot more sense because I was that was my next kind of tangent question was, well, how frequently do fires occur then? For something to have such like an adaptive pressure, to make all of these different species adapt to like the effect of fire, they have to happen relatively frequently, especially with a lot of these plants having such long lifespans and stuff.
Yeah, fire frequency is totally dependent on the ecosystem. We don't know what the true fire regime in Florida was. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
things are so altered now with fragmentation.
Let's take a moment to define habitat fragmentation. Habitat fragmentation forms islands of habitat scattered across what was once a continuous range. Buildings, roads, and fences can cut across and through, fragmenting a habitat. The effect here is that large populations can be broken into smaller ones, in which inbreeding or the spread of disease is more likely to occur, which is obviously not good. Fragmentation also prevents individuals from accessing essential resources. Take turtles, for example. Female turtles go on an annual journey from the pond or lake that they live in to their nesting site. We've all seen it, a turtle crushed on the side of the road. It's a horrible sight to see. The thing is, turtles typically follow the same path every single year. If one year there's a new trail or road cutting across their path, well, they have to cross it, and that can be dangerous. The wetlands still exist, but turtles cannot safely move between them.
Typically, like you would have a fire 1 to 3 years in sandhill, flatwoods 2 to 5, uh, and then scrub they say 15 to 50 years. We've seen evidence in like burn scars from doing dendrochronology and longleaf pine that there's been fire twice a year in some places, and it totally varies all across the United States from place to place.
Yeah, yeah. What would you say? I mean, aside from the fact that like, well, I don't know. Maybe you'll speak to that, so I won't get there. What would you say are some of the bigger challenges when it comes to trying to study how native plants grow, fire dependent ecosystems? Like what can make that difficult?
So some of the challenges, like one good one is like finding a good research site for the type of study you want to do. So uh, through, like you said, we had that Smokey the Bear thing, which, like, yeah, sometimes fire isn't there, but that caused this era of fire suppression. So a lot of these nice fire ecosystems have been degraded. So if you're trying to do research on like a pristine ecosystem that's had continual fire for a decade or for 100 years or so, those are hard to find, and they're even harder to find ones that allow you to do research on them. There are some great research stations, especially in Florida, that have really long fire histories. Another one is just how complex fire can be.
Hmm.
If you're looking for like a consistent fire pattern to go through your bit of the forest, it's not going to happen. Every time a different burn crew is going to be burning that property, and they're going to burn it in a different way. The wind's going to be going a different way that day. The temperature is going to be different. So it's hard to like make fire consistent. If you're saying I want to do a 15-year study and this fire's burned July 1st every 3 years with a west wind, that's not gonna happen. So you kind of have to like go with the flow of fire, where you're like, generally, I want you to try to burn in this time frame if you can, but if you end up missing that year, I'm gonna have to write about that in my paper and explain that.
Yeah, and so I mean, so we're talking here about ecosystems that, to be the healthiest that they can be, really do need fire as a crucial component because of the way that they allow for rapid succession, because of the way that they allow for different native plants to flourish and to spread. Yeah, we're also in the era of well, we're kind of still in, but also kind of post fire suppression. We have immense habitat fragmentation. What I mean in terms of, like, the future of using fire in these ecosystems and stuff. I mean, what do you see?
I see fire being it's going to be constantly crucial if you want the diversity that you want. You have to have fire. I mean, there's just plants that don't flower or don't produce fruit that's viable without fire. You can get away with mowing, but you're going to have like a different system. Uh, I think the future of fire is getting that public understanding, which is getting really, really good, especially in the southeast. It's starting to grow a lot.
Hmm.
Uh, and then it's also a lot of just like understanding that wildlife urban interface and like how can we burn near a neighborhood. And a lot of that is going to be you need to do a lot of treatment beforehand because they're so suppressed. You're probably going to have to go in and like almost do a clear cut and just leave like a handful of pines. So what you're burning is not a lot,
Yeah.
because eventually when you have just grassy fires, when you have like a nice good understory, that doesn't produce a lot of smoke, not a lot of ember, and the wildfire danger goes down a lot. So it's a lot of just like it's a long burn. I mean,
Hmm.
even in some places where I've worked, where we're trying to remove duff cones, which is like organic matter that's built up around a base of a pine,
Hmm.
you can only remove as much of like a quarter to a half an inch of duff a year without really damaging the pine. And some duff cones are like 3 foot deep. So you're looking at like 60 years of trying to burn away this duff cone to keep these really long lived legacy longleafs still alive. So it's a really tedious game. I've seen fire done in the middle of cities, so I think it's possible to keep fire going, especially if we garner public interest and we maybe if we even like make it a spectacle in a way, like have like a fire festival. That's
Mm.
been something Florida's done where they have like a community come out and there's like buses with snakes and they're talking about the native plants and the native
Yeah.
animals of Florida. While there's an active prescribed fire going on and they're describing like this is how they're burning it and you
Yeah.
get to watch that
Yeah.
distance.
Yeah. Talk about an attention getter for sure. You can't exactly ignore a big blaze. Yeah. Um, I don't want to. I don't mean to jump backwards too much, but I'm thinking, for a lot of people listening, they're probably thinking fire and plants. Like, how exactly does that work? And I know we mentioned succession and how it helps things to spread and stuff, but why? How on, I guess, on a smaller scale for maybe a specific kind of plant or something, how is it that fire interacts with that plant and is actually good for that plant?
So in my time as a botany bachelor's at UF, you would always have a question for professor, and the professor would almost always answer, "We don't know that yet." Plants are criminally like criminally misunderstood and unknown. We don't know a lot about how they work, how they respond to stimuli, how they use their hormones to grow certain ways and stimulate certain growths. So that side of plants, like the physiology behind fire, is solely like under researched. Mainly though, what we're trying to look at when we say like a plant is fire dependent is we're looking at like growth characteristics and things that we can measure easily, like in a traditional science way, where it's like we burn one plant is what we call wiregrass. It's crucial to fire in the southeast. It's like the main thing that spreads fire. Uh, and they did a study in Central Florida where they burned it basically like 4 different parcels of wiregrass in 4 different months in the growing season, which is like April through August, typically is what we call the growing season. And they burned May, June, July, and August. And they looked at like how big did the clump grow, how quickly did it grow, how many flowers stalks, how many seed stalks, then how many viable seeds came from each one. And they found that like in June, you had the lowest amount of viable seed. And in July, you had the most amount of viable seed. So like even the seasonality of the fire from a month to a month can make it so you have 2% germination rate or 60% germination rate. So that just shows, like in that sense, like, okay, fire is important.
Yeah.
Another species, which is lupin, lupins are like found a lot in like up north.
Yeah.
But during the Pleistocene, they got pushed down into Florida and diversified. So we have these lupins in Florida that follow this 3-year regime, which is like, okay, fires historically might have happened every 3 years, and there's this plant that almost is relying on a 3-year regime where it grows for 3 years, and then in the third year it flowers and fruits, and then if you burn it before it fruits, it won't come back, it doesn't resprout, and if you have stuff in the seed bank, it might come back, but if there's nothing in the seed bank, the population slowly declines. While if you burn them in June or July after the seeds have dispersed and are in the sand, they'll sprout back immediately. But if you don't have fire, it can take 3 years without fire for those seeds to come back. So the fire stimulates those seeds to grow immediately, and then it spreads really quickly, which is why it's called lupine, which is like a pack of wolves, and it spreads around and moves like a pack of wolves through the ecosystem.
Okay.
Is where that scientific name comes from.
I love that. That's awesome. I was even just thinking a minute ago when we were talking about how, like fire suppression and how people have kind of gotten unacquainted with fire, and so kind of that reacquaintance with fire is kind of an area of discomfort. People are like, why are we burning? And we don't like fire is bad. It's kind of like that with a lot of our like apex predators that are on the mend and returning in some places where people are like, what, these aren't supposed to be here. So, well, they were.
See a wolf and they get scared, and
then that
kind of deal. Or like there's a recent crocodile that made it up to like kind of central Florida along the coast, and people were freaking out. They're like, crocodiles shouldn't be here, and then like you look at historic amounts of crocodiles, and they were pretty far up the coast and pushed back.
Our time span of existence is very, very small, especially in comparison to some of these plants and stuff, right? Like I'm thinking even of redwoods and things on the West Coast.
Extremely long-lived plants. I mean, even like here in Florida, there's this couple that studied a plant called saw palmetto, which is it's a low-growing palm. It grows on like a stem that creeps along the ground. Really loves fire, but they studied a mortality of them over 40 years, and over 40 years, I think they had 12% mortality across like 400 or 500 plants. And most of the mortality was in a unit of scrub, so it was very overgrown. And it was a fire that was so intense that it melted the aluminum postmarkers that marked the palms. That was the only thing that really killed them, was a really intense fire.
Wow.
They don't die like palm bronzing disease or trampling, so they're really long-lived. And then based on like how quickly they grow in a year and how long we've seen some of these like clonal colonies to be, they're estimated to be like 10,000 years old.
Wow.
So
Wow.
they're practically immortal, is how that couple described them.
That's
They're really,
crazy.
really long.
Okay, so taking that kind of thing into account, the ages, the lifespans of some of these kinds of plants, the touchiness that you're talking about of the germination rates and the conditions in which they will spread or not spread. What does that mean for the restoration of some of these ecosystems, especially in places where fire might not be the most viable option? Um, is it doable? Is it possible, or is it really just it hinges on we absolutely need fire to make this happen?
It's it's really hard to do without fire. It's going to be a very involved process, and you're going to have to sacrifice some plants. Like, you can't have wiregrass without fire unless
Hmm.
you're outsourcing seed from somewhere else and putting it in your unit. And then you can mow it, but then it's never going to make viable seed, or it's going to make really low percent of viable seed from the mowing. Uh, Mowing is a fine alternative. I've seen units in really, really pristine South Florida wet prairie where it gets mowed annually for cattle. It was incredibly biodiverse floristically. It was, it looked wild, but they called it improved pasture because it was mowed and never burned.
Mm.
But it functioned all the same. The only difference is when you mow, you have that organic matter buildup. So you either have to like rake that away or hope it gets consumed away. Otherwise, you build duff, and that can halt some processes in like having a natural ecosystem.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, in scrub, which is typically like it's what we call scrub oaks. So there's three species of those, and then sometimes there's sand pine scrub where this pine species is mixed in.
Hmm.
Those have a really long fire regime, every like 15 to 50 years, and the fires are really intense, and it like kills the top of the trees and everything dies back and resprouts from the roots. Those are really hard to burn in Florida, mainly because a lot of scrub was turned into suburbia. So a lot of remnant scrub is surrounded by housing, and you can't have that hot of a fire in your housing. It's just forestry is never going to approve it.
Yeah.
HOA neighbors are never going to approve of it.
Yeah.
So there's mechanical treatment where you come in and you just mow everything. Works just the same. I mean, everything gets knocked back to nothing. The Florida scrub jay, which is like endangered and endemic to the scrub ecosystem in Florida, you meet its requirements. It just needs low oak cover to put nests in. So to forestry and to everyone else, mechanical treatment is fine in scrub, but to like a botanist or a biologist, it's like, well, the fire was really important for scrub lupins, and it was
Hmm.
really important for the scrub rosemary, and it was important for scrub mints, which are now federally endangered. And mechanical treatment will just not satisfy the need for those plants. You have to burn it, or you have to find a way to replicate fire without fire, which seems almost impossible.
Yeah.
It would be very involved. It'd be a very
Yeah.
costly and involved process.
Yeah. Yeah. So at that point, you're doing a kind of a cost benefit thing. And well, it sounds to me that if you go with the absence of fire approach, you now have more time, more money, more involved processes, plus you sacrifice a little bit of biodiversity. Um, so all in all, fire sounds like the winner, for sure. But I do understand, from just even a political perspective. I imagine if you did them in some places that the city council meeting would be stacked. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah, things would get dicey pretty quick. I get that.
especially in
Yeah.
the sense of scrub. It's too intense to have near houses. Like
Hmm.
I don't think forestry would ever entertain that idea in the state of Florida.
Yeah.
Maybe if it was like a sandhill in the middle of a city.
Hmm.
We've done that in Gainesville plenty of times because the fuel is just different. It's not going to be throwing as many embers is really what it is. Like a
Yeah.
scrub is going to be sending a lot of embers into the air, which is sketchy.
So something that has been a topic of interest for me lately, in particular, and I wonder if you are able to speak to it at all. Indigenous use of fire. I've been reading quite a bit lately about just how involved a lot of indigenous cultures were in intentional burning, prescribed burning, that sort of thing to kind of help shape ecosystems.
So a lot of the understanding of the native uses of fire, uh, unfortunately, has been lost
Hmm.
because the attempted eradication of the native culture. from fire suppression, and just from the lack of trying to like gain that knowledge when we first came to America and they were doing these things and we didn't understand why they were doing them. I think when the natives first got to Florida, I think they were greeted with an ecosystem that was already shaped by fire and especially shaped by the fauna of the area. If we think about like Pleistocene megafauna, like mammoths and mastodons and giant sloths and gomphotheres and glyptodons, like big things trudging around the earth, they're going to be scratching against trees, they're going to be trampling around. So trees would have been historically way less, which you can see from elephants in Africa. And then that low herbaceous understory is prime for fire already, and Florida's one of the lightning strike capitals of the world. So a lot of our fires are actually started typically right at the end of the dry season in May, and during those early growing season wildfires in June and July, when lightning just starts coming up again. You can see that in Florida when you look at like wildfires. Like it's pretty low, and then we get to this time of the year, and wildfires ramp up around the state. So I think the natives, I think they just were in Florida long enough that they saw this natural fire regime and they learned how to use it for themselves. I think they just kind of looked and learned, and they're like, well, this place burned 3 years ago, and now it's covered in blueberries. So maybe we should burn this place and see if we get a ton of blueberries. So I think they started working with fire and using it their own way. Nowadays, fire is there was a long period of fire suppression for the Seminoles in South Florida. The Forest Service was scared of fire in Florida for a while, so any reported wildfires were immediately turned out. So then this fire suppression showed up in the Seminole areas, which is like around the Everglades in South Florida, and their hammocks started getting overgrown, and the prairie started getting trees and things like that, and they were losing access to a lot of their historic medicinal herbs and things like that. But then in recent times, the Seminole tribe has started working with the Natural Resource Conservation Department and the National Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service, where they burn up to 15 to 10,000 acres of their property a year, and they burn 10 to 11 months of the year. So this continually long burn regime has allowed firefighters in Florida and firefighters that come to Florida to practice year-round on fighting techniques. So they'll get prescribed fire technician certifications. They can open up certain, I'm trying to remember what we call them. They open up certain incident reports, so you can like fill out things in this incident, so you can work out the chain of command in the firefighting community. While at the same time, the natives are getting huge benefits because these people are coming in and burning their land for free. They're helping in the burning process, and then in return, a lot of the Seminole women and men have seen a huge return in their cultural practices, with a lot of herbs being found in places that they have not seen for generations. Like grandparents and great-grandparents were telling them this plant grows here and then it's gone. Now with the return of fire, these plants are coming back. And they've seen the same thing with the animals. They've seen animals that they haven't seen in recent lifetimes coming back to their area. So they're gaining these benefits from the prescribed fire now. Of course, now there has to be some sort of help because it's a ton of land that they're in charge of burning. They have to burn at least 10,000 acres a year. And at the same time, it's it's good to help train those firefighters in Florida, because then we get more prescribed burning done in the Southeast in general.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah, one of the things I read recently was about well, it's easier to attract things than it is to track things. And so in the Great Plains, at least, rather than there's a certain point where rather than tracking bison, it became easier to attract bison, and so they would burn patches where bison had already gone through, so that you'd get that succession and it would kind of replenish everything, and then the bison would come back, and boom, they're right where you want them. And which kind of reminds me of, I think, where is that? Is it Australia? There's these birds. I don't even know what they're called. That like will intentionally spread fires,
Yeah,
which is
I
just so
forget what they're
funny.
called, but they're one of the few other animals that have used to learn fire to flush out prey. Which we see all the time on a prescribed fire line when we start a fire. The first thing shows up are vultures because they start riding the thermals,
Oh,
so they
sure.
can get really high.
Yeah.
And then you start seeing the hawks and the
Mhm.
swallows just catching everything that's running out of the unit, and especially the bugs.
Yeah. Oh, I
And
bet.
then
Yeah.
same day after a fire, even the day after, turkey. Turkey very common because they start eating all the roasted bugs.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Back to you more. Are you currently working on any projects or anything like that?
So right now I'm working on a sandhill milkweed establishment project.
Mm-hmm.
Sandhill milkweed is one of our native milkweeds. I believe we have like 15 or so in Florida. It grows in sandhill. It has a really interesting growth form. These very broad leaves. It looks a lot like the milkweeds you have in the Northeast, but it grows more prostrate, so it lays more on the ground.
Oh,
Uh,
interesting.
and we've grown it at the nursery to sell to people, and we sold them. And we had a lot of people message us back saying things like, "I planted it and it died, and it's gone. Waste of my money." People in Florida native gardening groups were like, "I planted this sandhill milkweed I got from the native nursery at UF, and it died." And we were very confused. We were like, "Oh man, we should maybe we shouldn't sell these." And then half a year to a year later, people are posting again, and they're like, "Oh no, it came back. It was underground for all that time." So I decided, well, let's see if that is consistent. If it dies back, how frequently is it going to come back?
Mm-hmm.
And it's also important for monarchs. So I'm like, how can we get these plants back into sandhills while also seeing their growth form? So
Mm-hmm.
I grew 300 of them, and I have three different light treatments. So I have like partial canopy, which is like a couple pine trees. I have full pine canopy, and then I have full sun, so like no canopy. And I planted 100 of them in these 10 by 10 grids, a foot apart, so I know exactly where each plant was planted, so I can find it month after month. 25 in each plot had above ground vegetative growth, and 75 had like died back. But when I took them out from their container, I could see the taproot was still alive. And then I planted all those, and I'm looking at like, was it more likely to live if it had above ground growth, or does it not matter? And then does it matter if it's partial shade, full shade, or full sun? What is the best place that they grow in? And I planted those October, I believe, last year, and I just started monitoring them in June of no May of this year. So I go back this weekend to study them for the third time. But establishment was really low. I think like the highest I had was like 6% survival
Oh.
rate. So it's been really low, but it does not matter if it had above ground growth or not beforehand. I've seen a lot of the ones that were dead
Mm-hmm.
resprout instead, and full sun has so far been the best place, which was not what I expected. I was
Yeah.
expecting the partial to be the best, but partial's been the worst,
Really?
and full shade and full sun have been pretty good, but full sun's been better, and I think it's a lot to do with like the water competition from the trees because it's been really dry.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping, since we've had our summer rains finally, that when I go back, I'll see a lot more resprouting from their taproots finally.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that actually makes a lot of sense because
So
if you
that's
have the
what I'm working
shade, you
on.
have competition. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then we recently just finished a project. I was helping a PhD candidate, a friend of mine whose name is Lucas McGee. He's doing a really interesting study that he just got published, where we were looking at longleaf pine seedling establishment,
Mm-hmm.
where we had like 9 continuous hectares of seedlings mapped and recorded. So we knew where every single one was, how big it was, its DBH, or not DBH, but like its diameter at the ground. And we started correlating how big they had to get before they like bolted, and then their location to other trees. And they made a heat map. It's a really good study. And what they found is that the longleaf pine seedlings were more likely found around oak trees than around other longleaf pine trees. So there's been this idea that like oaks don't have a purpose in sandhill and we should like cut and remove them all for longleaf. And then this study is showing like maybe you want to keep your oaks around if you want to have natural recruitment of these trees. So that was a
Yeah.
cool study that we just finished up and got published.
That's super cool. I'm like reeling through ideas um, at the moment because I have so I teach wildlife biology and biology at the high school level during the school year, and I've been trying to plan out some different ecological restoration project ideas, and I've been just thinking about, okay, well, what's something you could do that's more like a classic experiment that they'd have to go out and, especially with pollinating plants and things, and I'm like, it's like that the meme of all the different graphs and stuff going, like, ooh,
All these ideas flooding in, and you're like, I can do this, I can also do that.
yeah,
It's it's a blessing and a curse when you have those floods of ideas, because you're like, I can't process all this right now. I need to start writing it down before you
yeah,
know it. It's all gone.
yeah, absolutely. Well, for our listeners who are very, very into native plants and conservation in general, I mean, what is something that they can do, whether they're in the southeast or anywhere? What is something that they could do to help restore native plant communities?
All right, this is the biggest thing that anyone, well, not anyone, but almost everyone can do, and that is get rid of your lawn to some form or capacity. You don't have to get rid of the whole lawn. You can keep some of it, but if you get rid of your lawn and you start installing native plants, whether it's some native shrubs, you install a meadow, uh, any sort of native planting is going to be better than nothing, especially when you start looking at like entire neighborhoods that are nothing but mowed yards. If even a third of those yards had native plants in them, or a meadow or some sort of forage, you would see a huge increase in, everyone's going to freak out, insects. Of course, you're going to see a lot more insects around your area, but then you're going to start seeing a diversity. Keep trying to mix huh, diversity in birds. I'm mixing those words together. You'd see a huge increase in the diversity of birds since you have more insects, and it all just kind of feeds into it. So I think just getting rid of the lawn is a really good article or resource by the Xerxes Society.
Mm-hmm.
It's called the Xerxes Society Organic Site Preparation Guide, and it's got like 7 different ways you can prep a site for native planting. It's a really good resource. It's how I installed a native meadow at my mom's house, and it's doing really good. Another thing is look around at local native plant chapters. I know not every state has native plant chapters. Florida has one for every county, I believe. Some might be statewide, but get involved with the native plant chapter. See if there's any things going on around you. If you don't have a native plant chapter, Facebook groups. Start looking up your state gardening Facebook group. So Florida Native Gardening Group or Illinois Native Gardening Group, and just start joining and asking questions and seeing if people are willing to trade plants and give you advice on how they got some sort of native plants involved in their ecosystem. If you don't have a yard and you live in an apartment complex, see if there's any native plants you can grow indoors. It might not do anything uh, ecologically because no bugs can get to it, but if you decide to throw it out, you're not throwing out a potential invasive plant
Mm-hmm.
that then spreads. You're throwing out something native that maybe it establishes, and now you've just helped a native plant live in the wild.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I do. I've been trying very hard. This year we just kind of were like, you know what? Who cares about judgment from our neighbors? We're gonna go full meadow back here.
Yeah,
And I love that you mentioned the bugs. I had interviewed someone a while back, goes by Bug, Eric Eaton. He's a big bug biologist. He's written books about wasps and stuff. And he had mentioned, if you don't see bugs, then something is wrong. Like, if there is some damage on your plants from insects, that is a good thing. It is a good thing that they are there, that they are inhabiting the space. It's concerning when everything is pristine and completely untouched and there
yeah.
are
There's
nothing,
nothing using any.
Yeah. And so, I mean, and I've seen that a lot. The biodiversity of my backyard has picked up tremendously this year, just from leaving certain plants be and planting others and stuff. It's just been amazing to watch. It's like, I wish I had done more of like a before and after, like biodiversity logging and iNaturalist or something like that.
I,
It's super cool, super cool.
I wish I had done something similar with like the pollinators. It was insane watching the diversity of bees show up in our front yard.
Yeah,
Uh, I've had neighbors compliment it. I've had neighbors physically like cut down our native plants bring life to this landscape sign.
yeah,
So there's mixed responses, but
yeah,
I keep that meadow right out there in the front yard for everyone to see.
yeah,
And what's nice about a meadow is typically you only got to mow it once a year,
yeah.
or sometimes every other year, depending like what you want to do with it. But super low maintenance, which is what I really like about them.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Ross. I really appreciate you sharing your time with me, talking about this stuff with me. This is a topic that like I honestly don't know how I've gotten to, because this will probably be like episode 186 or something like that. I honestly don't know how I've gotten to this point without talking about this, because it's always been kind of this like thing that I'll. Fires have long been a vital force in shaping and sustaining native ecosystems. They clear the way for new growth. They maintain the balance of our natural world. Yet in our modern fragmented landscapes where human development often stands in the way, using fire as a management tool is far from simple. The challenge is compounded by the increasing intensity and frequency of wildfires driven by climate change, with significant impacts on wildlife and the native plants that form the backbone of these ecosystems. While fire plays a crucial role in some landscapes, it's important to recognize that not all fire is good fire. A human causing a wildfire because of a gender reveal, well, that's a whole other story. Some ecosystems are more adapted to fire than others, and in many areas, the need for fire prevention remains critical. We have to protect human lives in vulnerable environments. The presence of native plants in fire-adapted ecosystems is also essential. They are the other piece of the puzzle. They are evolved to survive these cycles and provide habitat and food for wildlife. The obstacles are significant, but there's hope. By learning from the wisdom of indigenous fire practices, or the work being done by people like Ross Barreto, and embracing innovative approaches, we can find a way to live alongside fire, harnessing its power to restore and protect our landscapes where it is appropriate. With careful stewardship, we can ensure that these ancient ecosystems continue to flourish, supporting both wildlife and the broader environment, even in the face of a changing climate. The flames of renewal may be fierce, but they hold the promise of a resilient future. I would like to thank Ross Barreto once more, and honestly probably several more times in the coming days, for joining me today on The Wildlife. His lens, his experience was incredibly insightful, and I will forever be grateful. If you have any follow-up questions, please reach out. You can message me on Instagram or TikTok at Devin the Nature Guy. You can email me at devinlboker, that's BOWKER, at gmail.com. Both of those are in the episode notes if you'd like an easier way to access that information. If you'd like to support The Wildlife, the work that I'm trying to do with science and nature education, you can do that for as little as $1 per month at patreon.com/thewildlife. I am working on rolling out a new series of benefits. Now, we also have a chat on there for people who are member supporters so that we can discuss episodes, nature, silly questions, serious questions, really anything you like. And with that, wander often, wonder always, and peace out, rainbow trouts.